Thank you everyone for joining us today for our January meeting, our first of 2021. And we're almost halfway through our calendar, or not our calendar year, our ASHRAE year programming. So thanks again for joining us for another virtual meeting. Just a few announcements today. As everyone should be aware, the virtual winter conference is coming up in just a couple of weeks. It's from February 9th through the 11th. Sadly, it was supposed to be in Chicago, but of course had to be moved to a solely virtual platform. But our very own Chicago host committee is putting together a virtual tour of a new data center in Elk Grove Village and hosting a virtual escape room social event to interact with your colleagues from around the world. So you can sign up for that online off of Society's homepage for the conference. If you have won a chapter technology award this year or previously and have not submitted it to regionals for a regional award, the deadline for that is April 15th. Those can be filtered through our technology awards chair, who is Laura, and also sitting on this panel, or at least on your screen for right now. And they will filter through the regional vice chair, which is actually me. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Laura. I'm Liz Zakel, for those of you that don't know. In order to obtain your PDH certificate for this webinar, please email Don Doherty. His email is administrator@illinoisashray.org. That's where we get all of our email communications come from him. You can also find his email on our Illinois ASHRAE website. This webinar will also be recorded for later addition to our chapter's YouTube channel, which has been hosting all of our virtual recorded meetings for you to go back to. So you can check the past meeting presentations page on our website to view those videos. And again, per always, huge shout out to Don for all that he does for our chapter and for communications. A lot of people should have their membership dues either coming up or recently expired. Please, we'd love for you to pay your dues, but if you need any help with membership fee relief, please reach out to our membership promotions chair. Society is working on a program for some membership fee relief due to everything that's been going on. Huge thank you to our Women in ASHRAE and our diversity chairs, especially Nancy and Laura, for organizing today's meeting with Kenya. We're super excited for another one of our annual January soft skills programs. Since we are using Zoom, and this is a webinar, everyone will be muted by default throughout the webinar. So if you have questions to our panelists, either related to the presentation or having trouble viewing anything, please use the Q&A features in Zoom. They should be in your control panel on Zoom. You can also use the chat features to communicate with everyone in the group. So feel free to use that as well. If you use Q&A, you can submit anonymous questions. There will be some polling throughout that we'll be doing. You may need to exit full screen mode for the polling to work. I can't remember anymore, but when those come up, if you can't click on an answer, just exit full screen, and that should work out for you. Those polls are anonymous as well. And then there is also an anonymous survey at the end of the webinar when you close out of the browser. So we would appreciate any feedback that you could provide on that. It should just take a quick minute. With that, I will hand it over to Nancy, though I did want to tell you, just so everyone knows, currently there are about 44 people on this webinar. So you have an idea when you ask questions or if you chat with other people. Oh, and there will be some interaction throughout. So we might ask you to raise your hands if you have a question, and then we will call on you to unmute. So go ahead, Nancy. Thank you, everybody.
All right, great. I'm excited for the attendance tonight. I just want to thank Laura for introducing me to Kenya Jacobs, who's going to be presenting tonight. She is the Director of Diversity and Recruiting and Workforce Development for Trane. And Laura and I have worked with Kenya to come up with a relevant, and credit to Kenya, she did all the work basically, to come up with a really great, relevant presentation for this evening. And we just want everyone to know that we want this to be interactive. We don't want people to be shy. Part of us all learning and advocating for diversity in the workforce is being able to have the conversation along the way. So with that, I think I'll just kick it off to Kenya.
Thanks, Nancy. Let me go on and share my screen with the slides. Are you guys able to see the slides okay? We're good? So Nancy took the opportunity to tell you a little bit about me. I did get the opportunity over the last couple of months to talk to this team and hear what some of the unique needs were for this conversation. And what I've learned is that relationships are premium. So I've been with Trane Technologies now for about 8 years. And I've had a role once where I supported our sales offices, and we had many people that were active in ASHRAE chapters across the market that I was in. So I know from that group that you guys value relationships, and it's also super critical within our industry. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of an introduction, both to me personally and professionally. From a professional perspective, I've had an opportunity over the length of my career to have some experiences in oil and gas, healthcare, consulting, and all of those things really have shaped the way that I think about diversity and inclusion. So with those job opportunities, I've met people from different parts of the country. I've had the opportunity to work outside the country as well. And those different experiences really do lend, to how I see the world around diversity and inclusion and how I see the value of it within the industry that we are a part of. From an education perspective, there's also some interesting things in my background as well. So I actually have an undergraduate degree in computer science. So it makes me a different kind of human resources professional. I think about things kind of in a processing function that you would think of as a programmer, but I've also added some things in my background around education and currently pursuing a degree in business. So just some things about me professionally that I think will give you some insight to who I am, because I think we'll have richer conversation when you aren't interacting with a stranger, but interacting with someone that you know a little bit more about. The other thing is anyone who spent any more than 5 minutes with me hears at some point that I'm from Texas. I'm a proud Texan. I'm living now in Houston, Texas, after about 20 years of traveling for education and for work. The other thing that you may not know, when you think about diversity and inclusion, a lot of times you've seen in any training that you've done, or if you've done some personal reading, kind of this image of an iceberg, what you can see in terms of diversity above, the surface of the water and what you see below it. So what you may not know is that, yes, I'm from Texas, but I'm from a little pocket in Texas that's about 40 minutes from the state line into Louisiana. So my family's from Louisiana on both sides. It's a huge part of how I grew up. The town that I'm from in Texas even has a Mardi Gras parade. So it's definitely a part of how I see the world and how I engage with people. We're a very welcoming part of the state. And I do hold myself very accountable to also representing Louisiana. An interesting fact about me is I've only been back in Houston for about almost 3 years. March will make 3 years. But what a lot of people don't know is I bought a home next door to my best friend and her husband and her 2 children. Especially last year and even now with some of the closures and trying to have a bubble. My bubble right now includes my neighbors. So just a little bit about me, and it gives you some insight to the things that I hold very important. One of my reasons for moving back was to be able to connect with them. I don't think they realized that I would be connecting so frequently because I was going to be next door, but wanted to make sure that you knew a little bit more about me. When we first started talking about having a conversation around diversity and inclusion, we talked probably the first time about all of these possibilities. When we introduced the topic of diversity and inclusion, it's 2 words that if you bring it up in conversation, you'll get different reactions from people. People will have their own definitions of it and their own experiences of it. So we spent some time the first time talking, just narrowing down the scope to what would be relevant for this conversation with this organization, with this group of people. And where we ended up was with these priorities, really talking about why is this important to talk about now. I'm sure you as well have noticed that there's a lot more conversation that's happened around diversity and inclusion last year. I was curious to know, because I feel like there's even a lot more opportunities for people that do diversity and inclusion in terms of companies adding leaders and adding teams, and found out that since June of last year, there's an increase of about 30% in terms of companies that are adding heads to their D&I offices, are adding in headcount to their teams. So if you feel like it's a topic that's elevated in conversation, you're right, it really has. We're going to talk about the changing workforce and why having this conversation about diversity and inclusion with the workforce challenges that we're facing is critical. We're also going to talk about the future of work and how work will get done moving forward. And more importantly, who are the people that will be a part of our future workforce? And then we'll talk a little bit about blind spots and some of the bias that helps support kind of our blind spots. And then what I believe is really important is we can have a lot of conversation, but conversation that doesn't lead to action is just another data point. So we'll make it really clear at the end where some places are based on where you are on your D&I journey of good next steps. I know Nancy called it out and I'll do the same. You didn't sign up for a lecture. I didn't sign up to be in a lecture. I really want people to engage in the best way for you to engage, but I also want to be respectful of the topic. So everybody sees D&I as a different level of priority, and sometimes we all have our own experiences with it. And I know that sometimes conversations around diversity and inclusion are stalled because of fear. You don't want to say things incorrectly. You don't want anyone to be offended. And what ends up happening is that you have a conversation outside of kind of this active discussion where we could have addressed it or we could have answered your question, but you didn't feel safe asking it because you didn't want to be judged by the question. So what I'm going to do is the best I can in this virtual environment of trying to reassure you that this is a safe space to ask questions and to share and engage. Know that you've got a mix of people that are on the call with us and in this virtual space with us. So be respectful in how you ask the question, and we'll do our best to make sure we address it. And honestly, if I can't address it, it may be something that we're asking of the group. But I do want you to feel comfortable as best you can in this environment. So we have a lot of different ways to engage. If you want to openly ask, you can go into the chat. If it's something that you're a little, concerned about asking, ask it in the Q&A, and that way your name isn't shared. We'll make sure that one of our team members that's kind of looking at it will get it in front of me for a question to present. And then know that we'll do the polling questions, which are also anonymous. And we're using Zoom, so I want you to know it's anonymous and anonymous, right? So you won't be able to see it, and it's not something we can download and access later, so that you feel safe sharing and really responding in a way that's most appropriate for you. So when we think about like why this topic and why now, we're going to move into our first polling question. This will give you a chance to test out the functionality of the poll. But I also want to make sure that all of you know kind of how to respond. This will give us a little bit of a pulse check. So if we can get that first polling question up. And Laura, let me know if I'll see it on my side. I haven't seen it come up yet. Oh, there we go. So for this first question, I really just want to do a pulse check. How would you rate your company's focus on diversity and inclusion? Would you say it's too little, it's just right, or it's too much? And this isn't scientific. So this is based on your perceptions of the focus on D&I. There isn't a guardrail or a litmus as to how we rate too little, just right, or too much. Based on your perception, how would you rate your company's focus on diversity and inclusion? So give it a little bit more time. And then Laura, when you see enough responses, we can close it and share the results.
Okay, I think we're at 82% right now. So maybe just a few more seconds.
Awesome.
Okay. So I don't know if This is my first time being a panelist on Zoom.
Oh, there we go.
So I think we're sharing the results now, but it looks like 56% of our audience thinks that their company is doing too little, and 44% thinks it's just right, and we didn't have anybody that thought they're doing too much.
Well, no, this is super helpful. So I think for us to even know, right? So we're in an industry that's pretty diverse in terms of the representation that's on the call. But just to understand, based on what you believe is appropriate, we're saying that over half of our respondents are thinking that their organization's doing too little. So what I'll challenge you with today is to listen kind of in two ways. So I believe that if you're going to be a part of a conversation, before you even, especially if you're a leader, before you start thinking about cascading information, I want you to really be thoughtful about thinking about what it means for you as an individual, right? So what are the things you could be doing? What's your understanding of some of these things that we'll talk about? And then the second thing for you to listen for is, and how do you influence a change or some difference within your companies? So you really have to wear two hats today. Process it through first as an individual, but then also take the next step of really thinking through how do you influence the culture change within your organization that may, it may not even be change first, it may be awareness. Do the people that you sit beside or the people on your teams or the people that are leading your organization feel the same way that you do around the focus on D&I? Would they feel differently? And if so, how do you then begin to influence and model some different things? So 2020 has really been, it will be a year that we'll talk about in the way that people talk about the Great Depression. It was the year that, I have some pictures from a concert I went to in February. Who knew that the world would close only weeks later? But there were so many things that we were navigating and so many things we're still navigating. Within my team, we've talked about, just trying to manage through COVID. I'm in Texas. We shut down in different ways based on, how things were happening with our teams in North Carolina or our teams in Illinois or across the country. Black Lives Matter after the murder of George Floyd, the calls for Breonna Taylor. You had wildfires happening within the US and outside of the country. We're now navigating COVID vaccine, and all of the while, we had people that were juggling working from home, working from a kitchen table, right? It's temporary, it's not real, I won't be home for very long, to now saying, okay, maybe I do need to buy a desk. Maybe I do need to settle in, and you're trying to be the lunch lady and take care of kids in virtual school. All of those things kind of took place at the same time. One of the other things that popped up that was really unique and interesting was that people looked not only at the news for information, but they also looked at their organizations and for some of our larger companies to see what is your response to all of the things happening in our world today. So just an interesting study that came out, and this was done within 2 weeks after the murder of George Floyd. So end of May going into early June, a poll was done to a representation of about a little under 800, I think like 755 US-based employees, around what are your reactions to the actions that your businesses have taken in response to George Floyd. And 30% of the respondents said that their company released a public statement. Another 19% said that their companies held some type of discussion that was done with leadership. But people were very interested in what are our organizations, what are our businesses doing, what are the places, doing where I invest my money, right? So if you think about some of the other businesses that we really thought about, LinkedIn became a place where people kind of commented on, I'm really proud of my organization, or I'm really disappointed in my organization's response. But that was something that was interesting for me, that we were actually, looking to companies to have a perspective, and there was an expectation of a company to have a response. When we looked at it, 55% of employees thought as well that their companies should do something. So not just, kind of this poll that was asking, what did your company do? But going back to that 755 employees that responded to say, do you think your company should do something? And overwhelmingly, over half of them said there should be something that a business should do. So just something for us to be mindful of in this shift of a company has a lot more responsibility just outside of profit, but they've got accountabilities in the space of kind of sustainability. So there's a term that's been coming up in the last few years, and I'll share this with you, and you may have different levels of awareness to it, but it's called social sustainability. So when we think about sustainability, a lot of times we're thinking of kind of green initiatives. What are we doing to protect the planet? What are we doing, either positive or negative impacts on our environment? When we think about profit, of course, the same, well, positive or negative impacts in terms of the economy. But then there's this people portion that really has driven this concept of social sustainability around how does an organization coexist with its most important stakeholders, right? So the people that are doing the work, the communities that they're a part of, the people that are their customers within that community. What are they doing with nonprofits that are in the area? How are you addressing volunteerism? So that really is the space that D&I kind of has popped up in. So in my work, you'll notice that when they introduce me, I do diversity recruiting and workforce development. One of my primary partners is our corporate social responsibility team. So as this, year kind of progressed last year, this call for organizations to have a perspective and to have a perspective in regards to things outside of profit has continued to grow and increase. Something else that we looked at was a study in regards to, once again, business and social sustainability, but having, the question of, do employees believe that discrimination is a problem within US workplaces? So I want you to take a look at the study kind of in two parts. So the first question was, do you believe employees that discrimination is an issue in the US workplaces? 43% of the respondents, and there were once again the same population of 755 people, 43% said it's a major issue in the US workplaces. The second part of this study was, do you believe it's an issue in your workplace? So not just generic workplaces, but the place that you show up every day. Do you believe it's an issue there? When asked that question, the same respondents, only 14% said it's an issue where I work. So very interesting responses to in general versus specifically the place that I go to every day and contribute. When asked about your own unique workplace, those 755 respondents, 56% of them said in the workplace that I'm in, it's not an issue. When they went back and looked at the ethnic diversity in their respondents, 64% of the African American respondents said that it is an issue in their specific workplace. So what that brings up for me is we've got workplaces where people are working side by side. It's your teammate, it's your leader, it's your peer from another department, and you guys are working side by side, but you're having very different experiences. So when you think about even last year and all the activity in last year, when you lay that over kind of these teams, those experiences for different people, of course you have, I'm not a person with children, but how to navigate childcare, right? Everybody's kind of dealing with it in their own way. But in this one question about discrimination in the workplace, we know that the respondents here that were African American felt very differently from the larger responses overall. So just something to be mindful of, that even in this conversation about diversity and inclusion, know that I want you to think about it as an individual, but when you're thinking about the culture change in your organization, how does it feel to be that respondent that feels that it's an issue in an organization that overwhelmingly might not feel that it's an issue? And what does it feel like to be in that group? Are you included? Are you part of conversations? Are you making decisions that impact the culture of that business? So really just some things for you to kind of take apart in that study. Whoops. And I want you to think about it. So feel free in the chat, if you have a reaction to that data that was shared, I'd love to see kind of some of the comments that come up. And if any of those things resonate with you, do you feel that it's reflective of the questions? If they were asked of you and your teams, would they be similar responses? If you have ethnically diverse people in your workspace, do you think that they would have the same reaction or have the same kind of disconnect in some of the responses? Feel free to share whatever you feel comfortable with. The other thing, when we talk about D&I, I try to make sure that I provide you enough things to hang on to, that you get your need met for alignment. So for some people, the conversation of should you be concerned as an individual that's a part of an organization, it's a no-brainer, right? Like, this is just something that you need to do. For other people, they need some extra information. I want to make sure I give you that. So if you're thinking, especially kind of in the industry that we're in, if you're really looking at driving the growth in the organization in terms of sales, we know that teams that are not just diverse, but teams that are diverse and inclusive have 53% better return on sales when they have female representation on their boards. It's a study from Catalyst. Another one, if your goal is around market expansion, and I'll break it into two parts. If it's new market, right, you want to break into a new market versus if you want to increase your existing market share, we know that diverse and inclusive teams are 70% more likely when they have a diverse employees to capture new market. We know that 45% more likely for diverse firms to report a growth in market share. If you're thinking about overall financial performance, we know that Fortune says that 24% higher year-over-year revenue growth when you have organizations where they have a commitment to D&I. And when they say commitment to D&I, that it's a stated strategy or it's something that's published as a priority in their business. And then 35% more likely for companies with high level of racial and ethnic diversity to report above average financial returns. So what we know from those studies in a lot of different places is that when you take the added action of not just diversity, but diversity and inclusion, that you will also see the impact in terms of market share, you'll see it in revenue growth, and you'll see it in overall financial performance. The other thing that's really important when you think about a conversation around D&I, and once again, if there's some comments that you have or reactions to it, feel free to raise your hand if you have something that you'd like to share in that space, or put it in the chat or QA if you know, how you align to some of the research that was shared around financial results. Even if you've had the opportunity to start seeing some of that in your organizations, if you guys have a firm approach to diversity and inclusion. So I'll take you, we've talked kind of about some broad survey responses, but I want to share with you a little bit of insight into Illinois. This was really interesting for me as a Texan to think about, what does the labor force look like in Illinois? And when we're looking at this, I want you to think about it in terms of rate of participation. It's broken out by gender, and it's also broken out by race and ethnicity. The way the data is shared, let's look at gender first. So when you're thinking about it, you've got a total representation of your labor force. What we're saying on this chart is that in red, that 58.9% of the women who are kind of eligible to be counted within the labor force are actively engaged in your Illinois labor participation. For men, it's 70.1%. Regardless of gender and ethnicity, regardless of race and ethnicity, those are kind of the cuts for gender. When you look at it, your Hispanic population, those that are participating in the labor force, it's actually on both the male and the female side of the available labor force that's participating, it's the highest representation. So when you look at this, and of course this doesn't account for the different industries of work that people may be involved in, but it does show the 3 ethnicities that are most involved in your labor force. Does that kind of distribution look the same in your organization? Does it mirror what's available within your organization? Have you taken the time to see what is the available labor for the skills that you would need within your own your area? So just some information generically about the labor participation within the state, but I would really challenge you to start looking at what is available for the skills that you would need.
Kenya?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Laura, are you?
I was just gonna say a question came up in the chat. If you could define either the difference or when we're thinking about diversity and inclusion, or diversity versus versus inclusion? Like, I think maybe it would be helpful to define inclusion, the inclusion part.
So diversity would be diverse representation. So if you go back, let's say back to this slide, making sure that we've got, and we always typically think gender a lot of times in the US and race and ethnicity, but diversity would be having representation. It could be military veteran status, it could be sexual orientation, but having diversity and representation within your teams. Making sure that it's not, everybody's the same, it's a homogenous group. Inclusion is in making sure that those people all feel safe and able to contribute. All of them are valued in the same way. There's no leveling, no one has greater importance. There's a space for everybody to be involved. If you think about an inclusive meeting, it would be a leader who takes time to ensure that questions are asked and answered of everybody. Everybody has equal opportunity to share and be rewarded in the same way. So that would be the way I define diversity in representation versus the added benefit of making sure that everybody's included in the process. Were there any other questions?
Oh, that's it.
You good? And we'll talk a little bit more about diversity and inclusion and how do you ensure that you create a space for both. The other thing, and I'll give you, my first reaction when I saw this was post-millennial. Is that Gen Z? So the way that it's represented in this Pew Research talks about post-millennial workforce. And that's going to be anyone born kind of 1997 to 2012. And that population, of course, is going to be the population in our workforce that's going to continue to grow. Right now, it's at 9 million, where our baby boomers, as people retire and exit the workforce, that number is going to come down. But this group is really on track to be the most educated and most ethnically diverse generation that we've seen. So this is the workforce that we're hoping we can hand things off to her. So just be mindful of it, right? So this group is in that population of folks of kind of that 6 to 21 year olds, 48% of that population at the time of this study is non-white, 48%. So when you think about the workforce that we're kind of preparing to hand off to folks and the people that we want to get kind of ready to lead in these spaces, they're going to be looking for workspaces that are prepared to absorb them. That group being more ethnically diverse will have an expectation around what's the environment that they want to work in, right? And just by virtue of the volume, as people start to graduate and start working, we're going to see that our workplace mix will start to look a little different. So we want to be prepared for that, not be shocked by it. The other part of that is we know that they are right now on track to be one of the most educated generations. So at the time of this study, 59% of folks in that post-millennial window were engaging in some type of post-high school education, be it a four-year college, a technical school, community college. And what I would say is in that population as well, even those, and it's not of course incorporated in the study, there's so many ways to learn. So many of these people are not pursuing a formal education. They're learning through Khan Academy or through something on YouTube. So this group formally is on track to be one of the most diverse and then equally most highly formally educated populations. Is your workforce, is your work environment ready? Are you prepared to lead a diverse team? Do you know how to lead this team? The other part of this is on the diversity recruiting side, it's a buyer's market. Everybody's looking, especially since last year, to incorporate diversity into their workplaces. You know, are you presenting a face that's reflective of D&I? But the reality when you get into the work is this is not an environment where my voice is heard or valued and included. So as we have this conversation, once again, think about it for yourself as an individual. You know, how do you prepare yourself to be a team member to someone that's diverse? But then also, how do you think about an organization? Is your organization created a space where a diverse individual that's a graduate is going to feel a sense of belonging and a value in feeling like their contribution is valued. So just some really interesting research about how the workforce is shifting.
Kenya, can you
yes.
talk a little bit about equity and where equity fits in, where, you know, where we're seeing equity, diversity, and inclusion lumped together?
Yeah. So I'll tell you, in the last couple of years, you started to see the conversation, even in some of my roles that I look at that peers have, you'll see teams that are now the D&I office or the DE&I office, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So when you think about equity, equity really is about making sure that there is equality or fairness. So a really good example within our organization and many organizations, people have added programming specific to different affinities. So we have a leadership program that's specific to our women leaders in the business. So we offer for everyone opportunities for leadership development, but there are some specific programs like our women's leadership program that's carved out where it's kind of women only coming together with curriculum that's been designed to support in some of the areas that we know that our women leaders have either had less confidence in or had less exposure in. One of the other pieces that's really critical is they're paired up with a mentor, and the goal is kind of set to have some greater exposure to our leadership. So once again, equity is about fairness. It may be including some programming that's carved out or specific to a population to ensure that they've got a level of visibility, maybe that's kind of filling in a gap that wasn't there or naturally created. So diversity, representation, inclusion, about making people feel like there's belonging and value. And then equity would be more about ensuring that there's fairness in how people are engaged. Other questions, Nancy or Laura?
Nope.
Nope.
That's it right
Thank
now.
you, folks, for sending those in. It definitely helps. So when we're thinking about this, and like I said earlier, a lot of times within the US, we immediately go to gender and we often go to race and ethnicity. But there's a lot of ways to talk about diversity and inclusion. And I don't want to muddy the waters, right? So a lot of organizations are setting goals in place for parity within their leadership team from a gender perspective. A lot of organizations are adding ethnic and race diversity as one of the things that is a priority for them. But by virtue of even the teams that you have today, there's diversity on those teams. We don't always think about diversity of thought. We don't always think about diversity in terms of people's life experiences. So I do want to draw that to your attention, and we're going to talk a little bit about it and have an activity. So let me walk you through this model. So this model talks about, once again, if you've ever seen the image of like, here's the iceberg, what you see above the surface of the water versus what you see below. This gives us a lot to think about in terms of the diversity of your teammates, the diversity of the people within your organization. So if you start in the center, what's in the middle is really that personality and genetics, kind of the core. If you come out to that green area outside of it, what we're saying is these are the things that you've stepped into the world with, right? These are just innate. You didn't do anything to acquire them. They were given to you. It's a part of who you are, right? Learned would be the things that are, you've picked this up as you've navigated life. It's a part of your story, but it wasn't something you entered the world with. It's something that's kind of formed and developed as you've navigated. The last circle that we don't often think about is how does the organizations and the systems that you are a part of, how have they shaped and influenced you? One of the ones that I actually never thought about before, I think about education, but when you think about people's alliances to their schools or their allegiances to their fraternities or sororities, right? Things like that, I would even put into the organizational space because those are systems that you're a part of. So I'll give you an example, but I want you to start thinking of if you had to, use this as a way to define yourself, what are maybe two or three of the items that for you would be interesting ways for you to introduce yourself or to think about yourself? And important to you, think about, how this has maybe shaped the way that you live and then maybe even how they influence the way you work. So let me give you an example. As I shared, I'm from Texas, but what I didn't share was I'm an only child, and it was my mom and I, right? So we were a team of two. My mother worked in oil and gas because I'm from Texas, and I think it's required that everybody in the state does a run in oil and gas. But what she did and the way we worked was we are a team. And there are things that I need you to do to contribute to this household. And here are the things that I will do. You have to do your laundry. You've got to make your bed. You've got to pack your lunch for school. And those were just the things that we did. What I realized and how it shows up in work is I have a lot of value that I place on team members who are scrappy, who can just get it done, take the list of to-dos, hammer through them and check them off. I value people that put in the work equity. How that's a blind spot for me is if I don't see that in somebody, or if I see it in someone, I kind of have a halo effect with them. Everything they do is amazing because they're scrappy and they're a hard worker. So I've had to kind of take that on for myself to say, when I naturally kind of go there with people, that I have to coach myself out of it. So it's a blind spot for me. It's something I've noticed in how I work with my teammates. And I just am, a moth to a flame. I just gravitate to those people that I see are hardworking and scrappy because of a foundation that was set in me in the way that I was raised. So, Laura, I think you also had some examples you were going to share, and then we'll do the same again. We'll open the chat, and if someone even wants to raise their hand, I'd love to hear about some other examples as well.
Yeah, so a couple examples for me. So innately, I'm a female in our industry. There's not a lot of women, and just one thing that's probably not surprising to the other women in this industry, but I've attended conferences where I've been mistaken for like support staff or the staff that helped plan it, not as an attendee. Some different examples for learned would be, I'm the youngest of 4 girls, so growing up, I never saw any gender favoritism from my parents. We all played sports, we all mowed the lawn, and I think that shaped, I guess, probably pursuing a job in an industry where there aren't a lot of women. I didn't really see that as intimidating or a barrier. Also, I grew up in Wisconsin, which isn't very diverse, but my parents always hosted exchange students when I was growing up, so I always was around people from different backgrounds or different ethnicities, and it helped me be really comfortable around people who are different from me. And then finally, speaking of being from Wisconsin, and I'm sorry if it's too soon, but I do have diversity of opinion in which football team is superior in the NFC North. So those are just some examples from me. We'd love to have participation from the audience. If there's anyone that feels comfortable, maybe some contributing something here, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you.
I was just going to interject. I once actually thought, like, I had an interview at an engineering firm, and one of the women was a partner, and because she like let me in and like showed me where to sit for the interview, I assumed that she was the secretary and she was the partner. So it's just like I had my own bias that was kind of against women. So it's interesting.
No, thank you, Nancy, for sharing that. I think, in any of these situations, and once again, encouraging people, if you feel like you have something you want to share, and once again, think about how it impacts the way you live or maybe the way you've worked. Feel free to do that. Just, raise your hand or even put it into the chat for others to see, or if you wanted to send it privately in the QA. But when you think about it, I want you to also think about, right? So everybody has all of these things that make up who they are. How do you lead a team where there's all this other diversity that you may not even be thinking about?
Right,
And did we have someone that was going to share?
Yeah, hi. So I actually grew up with 2 older sisters that became engineers. So it's kind of and innate. So it's kind of opposite than what we're normally seeing in the workforce. Like I grew up with my sisters. They're much older than me. So I looked up to them and I was like, okay, well, I want to be an engineer. So it's all I knew growing up. And getting into the workforce, I never realized how lack of diversity there was. So yeah, that's kind of my, I guess I would say innate and learned. I learned about engineering as a kid. So.
Nope, thank you. That's super helpful. And, you know, when you think about that, it does, right? Like those experiences have shaped the way you see the world. And then you kind of got into the industry and realized, oh, this is a thing. Like we are, you know, there are not a lot of women in this space. But I want you to think about it in terms, if you've got a team of, let's say, 3 or 4 people, or your leader has a team of 3 or 4 people, how do you make sure that you're creating a space that's inclusive where everybody feels like they have an opportunity to share? And being thoughtful around how do you engage people to learn something that may be helpful, just something that we did that you don't even realize sometimes how it impacts others. For our quarterly town halls, there was a point where they decided to start using closed captioning, right? So the initial thought was this would be beneficial to people maybe who have some challenges with hearing. Well, it actually helped a lot of people. And we started getting comments around, wow, thank you for doing that. I had some issues with, hearing some of the pieces, or I'm actually watching it later. And I realized that what I thought I heard isn't what I heard. And just by taking that one small step of thinking about inclusion, it benefited a whole lot more people than the ones that were kind of in the target population. So just something to be mindful when we think about the diversity, maybe that we don't always see or hear. So to that point,
Kenya,
oh yeah.
Before you move on, there was another question in the chat. If you're comfortable addressing it, it's, I don't know, maybe a little off topic, but relevant to what we're talking about here. But the attendee wrote, presently there is only about 500 African-American female licensed architects in the US. Less than 4% of engineering degrees are awarded to women of color. What is your opinion on how we as an engineering community can address this low participation rate?
So I think you've got to engage at a lot of different points. So we don't have enough time, but I love this topic, right? So like I said, when I started this conversation, I was a computer science major, and I pivoted because my first job, I was like, I can't do this for the rest of my career. So I made a choice to exit. So even with those numbers, there are people that are educated in that space and then they experience it and exit. So you've got to find points of engagement. STEM awareness and awareness to some of these fields may not be something that you've considered, but how do you engage when people are in middle school? So, right, you get tracked in most of the educational programs around middle school for, are you going to have a rigorous science and engineering experience in high school? And those conversations really start happening based on how you performed in 7th and 8th grade. So are there opportunities to engage from an elementary, middle school level where you can introduce these things? And we were joking about this before we got started, like, how do you make the career sizzle, right? There's so much emphasis on things in entertainment and social media. How do we kind of take some of these careers and put them on level footing so that people see not just the opportunity and the work, but the lifestyle that can come with it? The same thing kind of goes through, how do we support people in middle school and then that transition into high school? And most importantly, how do we introduce some of these careers so that when people are making decisions? I made my decision on my major based on one teacher that I had in high school, ill-informed, but came into it and did well in it. But really, there's so many other careers that I just had never had exposure to. I would have possibly made a different choice. So I think there's some opportunities in putting some structures and points of engagement earlier to help people make the decision. And then I would say, like, I help with external partnerships, find organizations where you can kind of circle around. So ASHRAE coming around and making sure that students are successful through the college experience, either with internships or kind of helping them work together and seeing the path that they're on, are all critical things to kind of, bait that hook and then bring people through the process. Because there's so many opportunities to have somebody that you've engaged with. And then sometimes we don't think about it until we're looking to hire, but there was a lot of years and a lot of points where they needed support, and you could slide in and be that support and build some loyalty. Any other questions?
There's
Not
just
right
some
now.
comments. I was gonna say there's just some comments in here, Kenya.
Yeah.
Like Mary says that respect for the individual. She worked for Starbucks and it was very much a part of the culture. Pat says, great point on blind spots based on background. I grew up in a household with a highly educated mother and father, and I will need to be aware of that when interacting with others that did not. Just a couple comments to share.
No, and those are all appropriate, right? And I think the thing is, you got to filter it through yourself. So to Mary's comment, the organizations that you're a part of influence you. The places I've worked, I've honestly, like I've brought remnants of those experiences into this organization because it just becomes a part of how you see the world. So be mindful of it, but also know that you're at a different place possibly than someone else is. Maybe someone that's counting on you to support them and you don't see it. So to that point, we talked earlier about the differences between diversity and inclusion and even equity. We have situations sometimes where you've got diversity, globally representative workforce, you put a lot of work in to recruit diverse talent, but then they get there and they don't feel like they belong. They're not included. They don't see opportunities to grow and advance. So you've got a highly diverse workforce, but they're disengaged. And a lot of times the view for you is people are starting to come in for short snippets, see an experience, and then possibly exit. Other workforces, and think of kind of your environment. You've got high inclusion. Everybody's really engaged and they're supportive, but there's not a lot of diversity. So you can still win and perform in that space, but I'll tell you, as the workforce changes and the landscape of work changes, you may be inhibited in terms of innovation or being able to chase new market opportunities because everybody's had similar experiences and sees things in the same way. It's that benefit of having high diversity and high inclusion, making sure that you've got the diversity and representation. Your teams are really kind of, puzzle pieces of all the different experiences of other people. Think about the model we just looked at, and then all of those people feel safe enough to contribute and be a part of the process. So love to hear from the group if you've got some examples of maybe situations where you've been in a space where you've benefited from high inclusion or high diversity, or if you've been in situations where you've had one or the other, high diversity, but you've not had the opportunity for inclusion, or you've had high inclusion, but you've seen some opportunities in terms of diversity.
Kenya, this is Nancy. I was just going to jump in here. So I work at an architecture firm, so it's a mix of people with all different expertises. And when I first joined, I really, I kind of was trying to stay in my lane and like only weigh in when somebody was asking me about my expertise of engineering. And pretty quickly on, I started to learn that my firm really valued diverse points of view in design. And I wasn't really necessarily expecting that or used to that. And one of our like lead designers, he's like, oh, the best engineer I ever got, like one of the best ideas I ever had for like designing the shape of a building came from a civil engineer. Like, I always want to know what everybody thinks, because the more points of view I have, the more I can have the best design. And I think if we all kind of think that way and approach life that way, we will get the best. And that includes, something like the introvert in the room, like drawing out their thoughts, to get all the best ideas. So that was just kind of an example for me.
Well, and how did it make you feel, right? To know that she shared that story around like, hey, this, I support this. Did it encourage you to contribute more?
Totally. And like, instead of just being like, oh, this is not mechanical engineering, I'm going to stay quiet, I started to be like, hey, like, what about this color? Which was funny and fun, but like, I realized that people actually like valued my point of view. Not that they always included it. And I just think it just makes a better end product. And I guarantee that data that shows that businesses perform better with diversity and diverse points of view is exactly for all of those reasons.
We see things differently, right? We've had different life experiences. And if you can harness the benefit of both, that is really where you start to see what you talked about, Nancy, right? So you can have one idea, and we had an example on our team recently. It was a good idea to start with, but by the time this person started asking other people for, mind you, every contribution wasn't included, but by the time they got through the process of kind of engaging different people in different parts of our business, where we landed was outstanding. It was good, but it was phenomenal when it was done, when we included some other perspectives. And it also operationally was better because we thought about some of the things that we would have stubbed our toe on. So once again, just kind of adding to this story about inclusion, and Nancy kind of gave some great examples here, is there was a study done by Gartner that talks about, when you have high diversity and high inclusion, you're going to amplify the performance of that team. Inclusion kind of unlocks the power of that diverse team. And then this other study, kind of in the same group with another set of questions, was that 57% more collaborative than non-inclusive teams, right? So when you've got inclusion, the collaboration just kind of happens. And when they define harder, that people work harder was time invested, and then it was also kind of the intensity of work. So once again,
Kenya?
Yes.
There's a comment that I'll share, and then there's a question. One of the comments from an attendee said that one of the things they love right now is how easy it is to find diverse children's books and topics that include race, different professions, different family structures. They said books are my go-to for all the munchkins in my life, and it makes me so happy when I get them a book and hear that now my 4-year-old niece wants to be an astronaut or an engineer like me.
Right, like that's
a nice thought.
That is awesome.
And then there was a question about what are the thoughts on low diversity and low inclusion?
What are the thoughts on low diversity and low inclusion?
Yes, and Mary, not to out you, but if you do want to comment on that and take yourself off mute, we can invite you to maybe elaborate on that. Looking for you and the attendees to unmute you.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, hi Mary.
So just in perspective, I'm thinking about, a situation that I was in where there was low inclusion and low diversity. I feel like the low inclusion wasn't intentional though. And does that make sense?
It's I would say in most of these situations, if you've got low inclusion, I would say it's probably not intentional at all, right? Like, I don't think in that space, I'd wonder if it even is a consideration, right? Do we assume that we're included by virtue of we're all here together? And it's not something that you're being intentional about, but I'm not sure in your experience, how would you have defined low inclusion? What were some of the things for you that signaled that it was not an inclusive workspace?
So one of the things I think about, I call them those over the cubicle conversations, right? That happen very comfortably when you're talking to someone who's like you, right? Or who's been with the company the same amount of years you are, whatever that, or you came from a previous company and you know each other, you've got a relationship. But if you're new to the company, I feel like it's sometimes, and I don't think it's a bad thing, that it's on the new person to include themselves, and it's not always easy.
That's not easy. And I would tell you, especially in the example that you shared, that is not uncommon, right? So people, and we'll talk about this a little bit on some of the other slides that are coming up, just it's natural for us to gravitate with similar experiences. Oh, I used to work with this person. Oh, we went to the same college. Oh, right. Like, it's super easy to do that, but we've got to be intentional. There's got to be a choice to be inclusive. So to your point, you're the new person, but you're doing all the work to try to insert yourself. If you don't feel like there's attachment, at some point you're probably gonna stop extending yourself. So it's just something to be cautious of. And I would say there's something about watching for it in your organization, because a lot of times we find great people and then we lose great people because we don't actually ingratiate them and make them feel like they're a part of the team.
Good stuff. Thank you.
No, thanks, Mary.
Kenya, there's a question in the Q&A At a job interview where you were looking for a new job, how do you learn more about the company's approach to diversity and inclusion? I feel like the obvious answer is to just ask, but of course the company is trying to sell themselves as the best they can and will give an answer that may not be wholly reflective of the company environment.
No, I actually shared with our talent acquisition team. I found an article that someone wrote that was in job search last year that kind of talked around her her checklist, right? So I would say that things that are just natural, right? Look on the company's website. When you go to interview or when you talk to somebody these days, it's a little harder. Look around. Do you see the representation that you'd want to see? I'd say the internet is your friend and all the other resources, Glassdoor and all of these agencies that maybe have feedback from other employees. But you've got to decide, what you feel comfortable with. There are people that are totally open to being the first. And they're looking for somebody maybe that has a statement around diversity, or they're starting to see some action, but they haven't seen results. Or it could be somebody that's saying, hey, I saw it on the website and I'm fine with it. Personally, you've got to define what type of environment you feel like you'll be most successful in. And if it's really important for you to be in an environment that has not only a plan for diversity, but results, then that's probably something you've got to look for and prioritize. But I'll tell you, over the last 9 months, or probably the last 6 months, I've probably gotten calls from more people about, hey, we're adding a D&I team. In those organizations, they're building a strategy. So you may see something like that or see something at a company like that, and you've got to listen for the right words and then hold people accountable for the change that you're hoping to see. The other part of it is you got to be a part of the process. Don't just be there waiting for diversity to happen, but make sure that you're a part of the process. Are you helping with recruiting? Are you talking to candidates? Are you sharing your story about why you made the choice to choose that organization? But there are a lot of things you can do. And there may be some times when you choose someone and you get there and you're like, okay, nope, doesn't feel like this is actually real. You got a decision to make. Do you stick around and help them, or do you move on to somebody else that's already doing it well? Yeah.
And then Kenya, we got a couple comments that are coming in. So one that I'll read, it says, the engineering group at my current employer is led by 2 women. My 2 prior workplaces had men as studio leads. I've found my current engineering group distributes work and opportunities much more equitably than prior employers. I have benefited from this greatly in my growth as a professional, as I more commonly do work and tasks outside of my comfort zone.
That's awesome. And the thing is, when you see it, right, you have an accountability to replicate that. So none of this happens, in a bubble. An organization's culture is made up of the way that the people how you get things done in that business. If you want things to look differently, you can't wait on it to happen. You have to be a part of the process. So if you benefited from it, how do you cascade that to someone that's, an entry-level person or an intern? Or how do you actually share that with other people so they can do the same thing in the industry? And now you can change the industry. And it's really a great tie-in, because when we think about it, diversity by virtue of us getting together, there's diversity on this call. Choosing to create a space where people feel included is something that has to be intentional. You say, can't walk around and ask people, do you feel included? But what you can think about is, does somebody feel like I feel like I'm in a place where I worked at an employer years ago where we would joke and say, all my friends came from here. I can't leave because I'd lose all my friends. It didn't feel like work because everybody here was really, aligned to the same interests, even outside of work. But, at a minimum, I feel like I'm accepted. My hair's in braids. Nobody's worried about, what's going on with your hair, what's up with you. But that is something that's really important. I'm always going to show up as this person. And are you ready to receive it? Uniqueness, the things that make us special. Is it okay for me to have, and I'll share, I have a tattoo, right? And I always joke with it's an older person's tattoo. I got it over 40. Do I feel like my contribution has had less weight because I decided to get something that was meaningful for me? So you really got to think about, how do you get to kind of the goal of inclusion, and what are you doing to create a space for people to feel like they're valued? And it is a choice. So how do you, what are you choosing? And I had to get a quote for, Chicago. Talent wins games, but teamwork and intelligence win championships. When I talk about choice, all of you are probably a part of organizations that are winning in the way that you're working now. And 56% of you said you don't feel like there's enough emphasis on D&I. So with that being said, if you really want to get to that sweet spot where we get diversity and inclusion, that's that next level, right? You've got these people together, but it's the additive of teamwork and intelligence that are really going to get you a championship win. And for us, the workforce is changing in such a way that if you keep doing what you're doing, you're going to win. But at some point, the landscape is changing, the customers are changing, the talent availability is changing. And are you going to ensure, just like with business continuity, that you're prepared to kind of support the way that the world is changing? So really, this is about not only understanding your spots, your blind spots, but how it influences kind of the decisions that you're making. And we've talked about this, so I won't spend too much time here, but similarity bias from a hiring perspective is going to be one of the things that, you know, when you think about things that you can be impactful about, the opportunity to bring talent onto a team is such a critical decision, right? You get so few chances to add talent. And when you have an opening, are you going to change the requirements? Are you going to upskill, right? But one thing that happens, and I'll give you a really easy example. You're seeing somebody, you're at an event or whatever, and you notice that somebody has on a class ring from your college. Start a conversation. The person's a complete stranger. You exchange email addresses. Hey, let's, stay in touch. You have an opportunity that posts at your organization, and this person reaches out, person that you've never known before, they weren't in your class, you don't know anything other than they went to your school. They reach out and say, hey, I saw this opportunity. I'd love for you to maybe refer me for the job. So by virtue of the fact that you went to the same school, I'm sure this person's amazing. They produce amazing engineers. I'm an amazing engineer. And you take the added step of not only referring, but moving their name to the top of the list and getting it straight to the recruiter or to the hiring manager. So it's not that it's wrong, right? It's a relationship. It's kind of in the way that we work. You've had a great experience, but what happens in that similarity bias is you really don't know anything about this candidate. The only thing that you're basing your decision on their fit is the fact that they're like you. And a lot of times we're hiring and bringing people into our organization based on them being like us. And like us, right, shows up in employee referrals. It shows up in the people we invite to be a part of conversations. It's the people that we feel safe going to help with decision making. And it creates an opportunity and a gap, that blind spot that we're not really aware of. So it's just something to be mindful of. Everybody has bias. It's the way we quickly make decisions. But when you're thinking about being thoughtful about a workspace and the culture that you want, that quick decision is a missed opportunity to think about diversity. So a lot of times in our networks, we know that diversity sometimes lacks in the places that we live, right? And then sometimes in our social networks. And for a lot of people, they get diversity when they come into their workplaces. So just be thoughtful around your network. And we're going to talk a little bit about your network. So we've got our last polling question as we close out. So if we could put up this polling question, I want you to think about and evaluate your network. So you'll see 3 questions that are going to be presented. And I want you to answer with one of these 3 options for all 3. Same race as me, different race from me, a mixture of races. So we're going to assess your network based on race and ethnicity. This could be gender, it could be sexual orientation, it could be anything. But for this example, let's use something easy like race. My direct supervisor is same race as me, different race from me, a mixture of races. My closest friend is. Most of my healthcare providers are. So take a moment, answer and respond to these 3 questions. And then Liz or Laura, I'm not sure who's running the poll. When you feel like we've got a good response rate, you could share the results.
Okay, we're at 70% right now. I think previously we got to 80, so we'll let it go a little bit longer.
It's the most of my healthcare providers. People are running through the list. And this isn't something we do often, but it's just something to help us stay aware. I actually did it at the end of last year. I did it in particular for my physicians. So my direct supervisor for the response is here. 68% responded same race as me. 27% with a different race, but overwhelmingly same race as me. My closest friend, same race as me, 73%. And then let me scroll to see the last one. Healthcare providers, really, really close, same race as me, different race from me, kind of those two within a few points of each other, and mixture of races. So that's really interesting, right? Because I think about, these are the people that you trust, right? My supervisor, my closest friend, my healthcare provider who's making decisions on my health. But this for us is a potential blind spot, right? So if you know that in your circle, the people that you trust, these people that are super important to you, you can almost, by virtue of having, you know, a group of people that are just like you and maybe have similar experiences to you, create an echo chamber. So, you know, examine your networks, get in the habit of thinking, how do I learn about different cultures, or how do I hear about different things from different perspectives if everybody kind of sees things in the way that I see it? Open and expand your inner circles. You know, I've mentioned to people before, like even looking at something that's, you know, one event that's happening in the world and hearing it from different perspectives, because of my limited exposure sometimes to things. It's like, oh, I never would have considered that, or I never thought about that. Encourage other people to contribute to ideas. If you get in the practice in your personal relationships, you'll take it into your workspace, and just foster and encourage people. Like the example that Nancy gave, where she got the encouragement of like, hey, we want you to share different perspectives and the things that you see. If you can benefit from it, take that opportunity when you have the chance to ask for perspective or insight, that you're expanding the number of people you're engaging and the variety. You know, do you go to somebody that is not even attached to your work, but they have a lot of perspective, a project specialist or a project administrator on one of your teams that maybe wouldn't typically be engaged, but they've seen a lot and may have some insight.
Kenya, there's a question
Absolutely.
that seems relevant. It says, regarding employee referrals, should we unlearn it's not what you know, it's who you know?
I would say it's balance, right? So it definitely is something that, right, a lot of our teams, we get referrals. This is high relationship. There's no way that you're not going to know someone that's talented and not recommend them. I think for us, what we've got to do is make sure that there's variety in the referrals, right? So how do we increase the number of people we're bringing into the table? If we know that, you know, I think about technicians, right? So from an HVAC technician perspective, I used to always joke that we're only referring people that we know. There's got to be other people out there, right? So how do you build relationships in terms of organizations, or if you do have some diverse talent on your team, where did you find that person, and do they have other friends? But really, I wouldn't say it's necessarily an unlearn, but it's add to, making sure that you're widening the opportunity for us to find talent. If you always go to the places you've been before, we're going to find the same talent. What I would also say is, if you know, like from a recruiting perspective, possibly, if you've got a partner that you've used and you know, hey, these people produce great talent, but that pool is not very diverse, how do you partner with them to share that feedback? Hey, I'd love to find some diversity. How can we help you? How can we partner to increase the representation in the talent that's coming from this source? So I would never say stop it, but I would say definitely add to.
Hey, Kenya, there's a couple things before you get to the call to action that people shared, but not to everyone, that I wanted to make sure get heard. One was, Kelly says, when I was looking into doing my master's degree in mechanical engineering, the program offered some fellowship opportunities for women in engineering. This allowed me to pursue my master's at a great school without worrying about debt. So more effort by universities can go a long way.
That's awesome.
And then one other was, one of my first jobs was at a very large company that had very few women in professional positions. I loved the job, but I always felt like I didn't really fit in. I ended up leaving pretty much for that reason. The old boy network didn't realize it, but many of their policies did not encourage workforce diversity or inclusion of diverse employees, and they lost many good young employees.
So, I mean, especially when you think about policies, right? So if you don't have a diverse workforce that's helping to define the policy, by virtue of not, anything that you've intended to do, you may have created a policy that in its own process is not inclusive. So, having access to, people that are different than you to look at even something like a policy around something, you are going to get a far better product. We actually just recently introduced milk shipping, which was, I have no children. And I was like, what are we doing? But I never thought about it, right? If you have a nursing mom that's traveling for work, how do they get milk back to their baby? A lot of people were actually paying to ship milk back, and someone brought it up to our attention and the organization responded. I would never have been able to come up with that as something that was a concern or something we needed to do. But because we had people that have different experiences and different life experiences, that was elevated. So, there's so many things that we just don't even think about because it's just not in our world, right? So you've got to have other people weighing in. So yeah, thank you for sharing, especially the ones around policy. So the call to action, like I told you before we got started, that this just wasn't a lecture, and you guys have done phenomenally in response to the surveys and sharing your comments and thoughts. But when you know something differently and you have it on your heart now, you got to do something different. So what we're asking you to do is to be a good listener, engage in these conversations. If you don't feel like these conversations are happening in your organization, start them with your team and with your peers and with your managers. And be willing to have conversations with others. I will tell you, I've had conversations with some of my teammates in the last 6 months that I would have never envisioned having. But I felt like the door was open to have an honest conversation, and I've benefited and they've benefited. Be open-minded. And I always say this from a recruiting perspective, great engineers come from a lot of places, right? So be open-minded. Choose to be inclusive and think about what are the things that you can do for that new team member that's wondering, like, how do I get invited into this, Friday virtual happy hour that apparently people are doing that I've never been a part of. When you see something that doesn't feel right, say something. Say something, right? And sometimes the people that are in it choose not to say something because of retribution or retaliation, or they feel like they got to suck it up. Say something. If someone's not getting a chance to share and contribute in a virtual call, hey guys, can you hold off a second? I think Mike was trying to say something. Like, we are empowered to do that as well. Get comfortable being uncomfortable. These conversations are not easy. And when you open the door to have people share their perspective, it may not be something that matches with how you feel. And it may be uncomfortable to hear because maybe you've been an offender and you didn't even realize it, right? But once you know something differently, you can choose a different action. Build.
Kenya,
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, along those lines, there was a question in the chat. I think you kind of touched on one example there, but the person that wrote in was asking to hear comments on what some signs may be that someone's not feeling comfortable or accepted, and how as a leader they can spot it early and try to fix it. So I think you gave the one example if someone's not like speaking up, but if you maybe have any other ideas from like body language or something along those lines.
And right now it's super tough, right? So many of us are virtual. But I would say, connection happens, right? We don't always need a formal meeting to have connection. So you may just want to get in the habit of, casually checking on people. If you're using Zoom or Teams or Skype, is an opportunity to have just some small one-on-ones with people. If you're asking for feedback and you notice that, if you got cameras on versus cameras off, you can kind of see people shutting down. Do people get, they look like they're starting to share and then people over talk over them and they don't get a chance to contribute. Declining work. If you feel like people are producing just what you've asked for and they were somebody who has always given a little more, right? And I would say in 2021, or as a friend said last week, December 37th, right? Whatever day it is, you may want to just check in and see if it's COVID fatigue or if there's really an opportunity where they're not feeling like they're a part of the team. But I think right now for leaders and managers, we have a responsibility that's a little greater than usual to make sure that everybody's okay. And you may have to dig a little deeper to figure out, is it something that, we need to do from an inclusion perspective, or is it just someone's an overload because of everything else they're juggling? And all of those things are relevant right now, right? So I have a team member who's working a different schedule because she's just trying to navigate some other things. So she's working at 7 in the morning or 6 in the morning to 2 or something like that. And I said, hey, here's kind of the difference of when you can do that, when you own the schedule or if the meeting's happening. But if that's going to make it easier for you to balance what you're doing here and work, then we're going to make it happen. Yeah, but I think we've got to check in just to see what it is. And then just the last thing is that we have a responsibility. Opportunities to add talent to our team are so rare. And I've heard people say, well, we've got somebody that's already on deck. Just opening up that rec to see, is there other talent out there? Maybe this person is a fit for the role that we have now because we've got internal talent, but maybe we've made a connection and that's somebody we can engage with for future opportunities. So don't lose the opportunity to build diverse and inclusive teams. And one of the things that I just stumbled upon, we actually are doing this in my state, and I saw that you guys have an opportunity for it as well. Something that's an easy way to continue to be informed is the United Way is hosting, in some areas it's a 21-day equity challenge. In Illinois, it's a 21-week equity challenge. They're sending everybody an email from Dr. Martin Luther King holiday to Juneteenth. And it's kind of things you could learn about. So topics could be around redlining and what that looks like in your area, and the history of redlining in certain communities. Any of those topics, just to introduce and build new awareness. It's 100% free. You just provide your email and then you're included in these messages. So if you're looking for a way to continue to learn and continue to grow in your awareness around D&I, this is an easy way to do it. And it's automatic. It's going to come to you. So I'll definitely leave it open if you guys have any other questions. But thank you so much for your participation.
Kenya, thank you
Yeah.
so much. This was absolutely awesome. And I love how much everybody contributed. I just wanted to say thank you so much.
Oh, thank you guys. And team, I will tell you, you have the right people working on this. Nancy and Laura were great partners. And then Liz has helped make everything really smooth today. But if there are any other questions, I'll answer them for you. And then these ladies know how to reach out to me if there's something that pops up after.
I just wanted to reiterate, thank you so much, Kenya, as well as, if you're interested in the PDH for this program, you can email Don Doherty. He's the administrator email address that we have. And you can also find this eventually on our YouTube channel that you can get through from our Illinois website.
Awesome.
And I also added in the chat the Equity Challenge website address.
Awesome. I'm encouraged to possibly sign up for the Illinois one. The one in Texas is aggressive. It's 21 days.
You're getting lots of compliments in the chat as well, Kenya.
No,
Good
thank
job.
you guys. This is awesome that you guys have created a space for these types of conversations. And like I said, once you know something and you've heard it, you have an accountability to take some action on it. So please, please, please make sure that you sign up for the Equity Challenge if that's something that would be useful, or pick at least one thing that you want to take forward individually or even with your teams.